A millionaire leaves his wife for a younger model, thinking he's traded up. But on his wedding day, he sees her walk in, with triplets, who have his eyes. The perfect life he built is about to unravel as the woman he abandoned stands stronger than ever, forcing him to face the truth. His fiancée's smile fades, his past collides with his present, and suddenly, everything he thought he wanted means nothing. Will he fight for the family he never knew he had, or lose them forever? Some mistakes can never be undone. Before we get into the story, comment below where in the world you are watching from today, and if you're enjoying these stories, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow's special episode is one you definitely don't want to miss. Margaret Reed smoothed her emerald silk dress as she stepped out of the limousine, her husband Patrick's hand resting lightly at the small of her back. Camera flashes burst around them as they ascended the marble steps of the Grand Plaza Hotel. The annual Children's Hospital Charity Gala was the social event of the season, and the Reeds were fixtures on the guest list. "Mr. and Mrs. Reed over here," a photographer called out. Patrick flashed his practiced smile, the one that had graced the cover of Business Elite magazine last spring. At 40, with distinguished salt and pepper hair and piercing blue eyes, he commanded attention in his perfectly tailored tuxedo. "Another year, another gala," Margaret whispered, her warm hazel eyes finding his as they posed. "Another $10,000 for sick kids," Patrick replied, but his smile didn't quite reach his eyes. Inside, crystal chandeliers cast a golden glow over the ballroom. Margaret accepted a glass of champagne from a passing waiter, taking a small sip. She shouldn't be drinking at all, not during fertility treatments, but one glass for appearance's sake wouldn't hurt. Besides, after 4 years of treatments, disappointments, and the latest failed IVF attempt last month, she was beginning to lose hope. "I see the Harrises," Patrick said, already steering them across the room. "Brad's considering investing in the lakeside development." Margaret nodded, falling into her role as the supportive wife. While Patrick networked, she engaged in pleasant small talk, all while a familiar emptiness gnawed inside her. The fertility clinic had called yesterday with the same devastating news: negative results. She hadn't told Patrick yet. He'd been so distant lately, buried in work, coming home late. She didn't want to add another disappointment. "Margaret, darling." Elaine Winters air-kissed both her cheeks. "How are you? Any baby news yet?" Margaret's smile tightened. "Not yet," she said softly, "but we're still trying." "Well, don't wait too long," Elaine said with a laugh. "Patrick's not getting any younger." Across the room, Patrick excused himself from a conversation with investors and headed toward the bar. The weight of another business deal closed should have felt satisfying, but lately, nothing seemed to fill the restlessness inside him. He ordered a scotch, neat. "Make that too," came a voice beside him. Patrick turned to find himself staring into the most striking green eyes he'd ever seen. The woman was younger, mid-20s perhaps, with cascading blonde hair and a red dress that hugged every curve. "I hate these events," she said conspiratorially, accepting her drink. "All these people pretending to care about charity when they're really just here to be seen." Patrick laughed, surprised by her candor. "You don't pull punches, do you?" "Life's too short for small talk." She extended her hand. "Vanessa Chambers." "Patrick Reed." He took her hand, noticing how delicate it felt in his. "The real estate developer? I've read about you." Her eyes sparkled with interest. "Your Riverside project was brilliant." Pride swelled in his chest. "You follow real estate development?" "I follow success," Vanessa said, her gaze holding his. "I'm a fashion designer. Just launched my first collection." "Impressive. Not as impressive as building an empire from nothing." She touched his arm lightly. "Your wife must be so proud." Patrick's eyes automatically searched the room for Margaret. She was engaged in conversation with the hospital board members, poised and elegant as always. For a moment, he remembered their early days, her laugh as they picnicked in Central Park, how she'd believed in him when he was nobody. "Yes," he said, turning back to Vanessa. "She is. Lucky woman." Vanessa's voice dropped lower. "Some men achieve success and lose their edge. You seem sharper than ever." The compliment warmed him in ways he hadn't felt in years. He found himself leaning closer, drawn to her youth, her energy, her obvious admiration. "Tell me about your collection," he said, no longer thinking about potential investors or business deals. For the next hour, Patrick remained captivated by Vanessa. She was ambitious, direct, and looked at him with an intensity that made him feel 25 again. When she mentioned her studio was nearby, he found himself suggesting they meet for lunch sometime to discuss her business plans. "I'd like that," she said, slipping her card into his pocket, her fingers lingering longer than necessary. Later that night, Margaret sat at her vanity, removing her earrings. Patrick moved around their bedroom, loosening his tie. "The gala raised over $2 million, she said, watching him in the mirror. "Remember our first one? You were so nervous about meeting the mayor." "That was a long time ago," Patrick replied, his thoughts elsewhere. Margaret turned to face him. "Do you ever miss those days, when it was just us in that tiny apartment, dreaming about the future?" Patrick paused, a flicker of something. Guilt, perhaps, crossing his face. But Vanessa's green eyes and admiring smile flashed in his mind. "We've built the future we dreamed of," he said flatly. Margaret reached for his hand. "Have we? Sometimes I feel like we're drifting apart." Patrick squeezed her fingers briefly before pulling away. "I'm tired, Margaret. It's been a long day." As he disappeared into the bathroom, Margaret sat alone, the silence of their beautiful home echoing around her. Outside their window, Manhattan glittered with promise, but inside, she'd never felt more alone. 2 weeks after the gala, Patrick checked his watch as he stepped into the trendy Soho cafe. Vanessa sat at a corner table, sunlight catching the gold in her hair. His heart quickened as she looked up and smiled. "I wasn't sure you'd come," she said as he slid into the seat across from her. "I had a meeting nearby." The lie came easily now, after 3 such accidental lunch meetings. "Of course." Her knowing smile suggested she understood the game they were playing. "How's the Hamilton project?" Patrick launched into details about his latest development, energized by her focused attention. With Margaret, he'd stopped sharing work stories years ago, tired of her practical questions about sustainability and community impact. Vanessa asked about profit margins and celebrity neighbors, questions that centered his vision, his success. "You're extraordinary," she said, touching his hand. "Some men would be content with what you've built, but you're still hungry." "I've always wanted more," he admitted. "More is exactly what you deserve." Her fingers intertwined with his, and Patrick didn't pull away. The following Tuesday, Margaret sat stunned in her doctor's office, the words still ringing in her ears. "You're pregnant, Mrs. Reed, about 6 weeks along." That's impossible," she whispered. "The last treatment failed." Dr. Chen smiled warmly. "Sometimes nature surprises us when we least expect it. And there's more. The ultrasound shows multiple embryos. It appears you're carrying triplets." Margaret pressed her hand to her mouth, tears spilling down her cheeks. After years of treatments, heartbreak, and monthly disappointments, the miracle had happened naturally. 3 babies. She and Patrick were going to be parents. That evening, Margaret transformed their dining room. She covered the table with their wedding china, lit candles, and prepared Patrick's favorite meal, beef Wellington with truffle mashed potatoes. She'd bought a tiny pair of baby booties, wrapped in blue paper, which she placed beside his plate. At 7:30, she heard his key in the door. Her hand instinctively went to her still flat stomach. Their lives were about to change forever. "Patrick, I'm in the dining room," she called out. He appeared in the doorway, his expression unreadable as he took in the elaborate setup. "What's all this?" "I wanted us to have a special evening." She smiled, nervousness fluttering in her chest. "Come sit down." Patrick remained standing, his posture stiff. "I can't stay for dinner." "Oh." Margaret's smile faltered. "But I made your favorite, and I have something important to tell you." "I have something to say too." His voice was cold, detached. "I think it's best if I go first." A chill ran through Margaret's body. She knew before he spoke what was coming, had perhaps known for weeks but refused to acknowledge it. "I want a divorce." The words hung in the air between them. The candles flickered, casting shadows across his face. "Patrick," she whispered, "whatever's wrong, we can fix it." "Nothing's wrong. That's the point." He wouldn't meet her eyes. "I've simply realized this isn't the life I want anymore." "After 15 years?" Her voice cracked. "What about our plans? Our family?" "That's part of the problem, isn't it?" His words turned cruel. "We don't have a family. We never will. I'm 40 years old, Margaret. I want children before it's too late." Each word was a physical blow. Margaret gripped the back of a chair to steady herself, the irony of his statement making her dizzy. The wrapped booties sat on the table, suddenly a mockery. "Is there someone else?" she asked quietly. Patrick's hesitation was answer enough. "Her name is Vanessa," he finally said. "She's young, vibrant. She sees me in a way you haven't in years." "I see you perfectly clearly," Margaret replied, her voice steadying despite the pain tearing through her. "I always have." "I love her," Patrick continued, as if Margaret hadn't spoken. "She makes me feel alive again." Margaret looked at the man she'd built her life around, the man who now couldn't wait to discard her, and made a split-second decision. The joy she'd felt in the doctor's office transformed into fierce protectiveness for the tiny lives growing inside her. He didn't deserve to know. "I'll have my lawyer contact yours," Patrick said, already turning away from the uneaten meal, the undelivered news. Margaret watched him walk out the door, her hand pressed against her stomach, silent tears streaming down her face. The divorce papers arrived 3 days after Patrick walked out. Margaret sat at her kitchen table, staring at the thick envelope with its law firm letterhead. She'd expected this, but not so quickly. Her hand trembled as she opened it, scanning the cold legal language that reduced 15 years of marriage to irreconcilable differences. What she hadn't expected was the settlement offer. Margaret frowned, reading the numbers again. The amount was insultingly low, barely enough to maintain a modest apartment for a few years, let alone start over. "This can't be right," she murmured, flipping through the pages. Their investment portfolio, which she knew contained over $2 million, was conspicuously absent. The vacation property in Aspen, purchased with money she'd inherited from her grandmother, was listed solely in Patrick's name. Even their primary residence, which they'd renovated together room by room, was valued at half its market price. The nausea that had been her constant companion these past weeks surged again. Margaret barely made it to the bathroom before emptying her stomach. As she rinsed her mouth, she caught her reflection in the mirror. Pale, with dark circles under her eyes. The pregnancy was taking its toll, and the stress of Patrick's betrayal only made it worse. "He's hiding assets," her lawyer confirmed 2 days later. Barbara Chen was a formidable divorce attorney with a reputation for protecting women from exactly this kind of manipulation. "We'll fight this, Margaret. He can't just rewrite history and pretend you didn't contribute to building his empire." Margaret nodded, her hand instinctively resting on her stomach. "There's something else you should know." Barbara's eyes widened as Margaret shared her news. "Triplets? And he doesn't know. Number, and I want to keep it that way." Legally, that complicates things. He has paternal rights. He gave up those rights when he said I couldn't give him children and walked out on our marriage, Margaret said firmly. The man who's rushing to divorce me while hiding money and flaunting his girlfriend around town isn't someone I want influencing my children. Barbara sighed. I understand your feelings, but eventually I'll figure it out. But right now, I need to protect myself and my babies. The following week, Margaret's phone buzzed with a text from Thomas Lawson. They'd grown up on the same street, and though life had taken them in different directions, they'd maintained a casual friendship over the years. Heard about Patrick? Free for coffee tomorrow? Thomas was waiting at their favorite cafe when she arrived, his kind eyes immediately registering the changes in her appearance. You look exhausted, he said, pulling out her chair. Always the charmer, Margaret replied with a small smile. That's what happens when your husband leaves you for a woman barely out of college. Thomas's expression darkened. Patrick always was an idiot, but even I didn't think he'd be this stupid. For the first time in weeks, Margaret felt the tension in her shoulders ease slightly. She hadn't realized how desperately she needed someone who wasn't a lawyer or doctor to talk to. There's more, she admitted, lowering her voice. I'm pregnant, with triplets. Thomas nearly dropped his coffee. Does he? Number. And I don't want him to know. Instead of the lecture she expected, Thomas simply nodded. I understand, and as a pediatrician, I'm officially offering my services. You're going to need all the help you can get. Tears pricked Margaret's eyes. Thank you. That evening, Margaret scrolled through social media, a masochistic habit she couldn't seem to break. There it was, Patrick and Vanessa at the opening of a new art gallery. She was draped over him in a dress that cost more than most people's monthly rent, while he beamed with the satisfied look of a man who believed he'd upgraded. The caption read, Power couple Patrick Reed and designer Vanessa Chambers electrify the room at the Harrington Gallery opening. As Margaret stared at the image, she felt something shift inside her. The heartbreak was still there, but alongside it grew a steely resolve. Patrick was showing his true colors, not just to her, but to everyone. He'd traded their history, their partnership, their future family for a younger woman and the illusion of freedom. He doesn't deserve to know about you, she whispered to her unborn children, closing the app and placing her phone face down on the table. And someday, when you're old enough to understand, I'll tell you everything. But for now, we're going to build a life without him. 3 months after the divorce was finalized, Patrick Reed stood on the deck of the 60-foot yacht he'd rented for the occasion. Champagne flowed freely as Miami's skyline glittered against the night sky. He'd invited the city's elite, developers, politicians, celebrities, to witness what he considered the crowning achievement of his year, securing Vanessa Chambers as his wife. Everyone, if I could have your attention, Patrick called, tapping his champagne flute with a silver spoon. The crowd quieted as Vanessa moved to his side, her sequined dress catching the light. These past months have been transformative. Sometimes life surprises you with exactly what you need when you need it. He reached into his pocket and produced a black velvet box. As he dropped to one knee, gasps rippled through the assembled guests. Vanessa's green eyes widened with delight. Vanessa, you've brought youth and passion back into my life. Will you marry me? The 5-carat diamond sparkled as he opened the box. Vanessa's perfectly manicured hand flew to her mouth in a practiced gesture of surprise. Yes, of course, yes, she squealed, allowing him to slide the ring onto her finger before pulling him up for a camera-ready kiss. Applause erupted around them. Patrick felt a surge of triumph. At 40, he was engaged to a gorgeous 27-year-old designer whose star was rising. He'd successfully shed his old life and the wife who couldn't give him children for this vibrant new beginning. Across town, in a dimly lit examination room, Margaret Reed stared at the ultrasound monitor in disbelief. 3, she whispered, her voice barely audible. Did you say 3? Dr. Patel nodded, moving the wand carefully across Margaret's rounded belly. 3 healthy fetuses, all developing normally. She pointed to the screen. Here, here, and here. Congratulations, Ms. Reed. You're carrying triplets. Margaret's grip tightened on Thomas Lawson's hand. He winced slightly, but didn't pull away. Triplets, Margaret repeated, feeling lightheaded. I can't. How will I? Panic rose in her chest, constricting her breathing. 1 baby had seemed manageable, challenging but doable. But 3. Margaret, breathe, Thomas said gently, his calm voice anchoring her. In through your nose, out through your mouth. That's it. Dr. Patel printed several images of the ultrasound. I'll give you 2 a moment. This is big news. She slipped quietly from the room. As soon as the door closed, Margaret's composure crumbled. 3 babies, Thomas. 3. I'm going to be a single mother to 3 newborns. What was I thinking? Thomas pulled his chair closer, still holding her hand. You were thinking you wanted these children. That hasn't changed. But everything else has. I'll need 3 of everything. Triple the diapers, triple the formula, triple the... Her voice broke. Triple the love. Thomas finished for her. And you won't be doing this alone. Margaret looked up at him through tear-filled eyes. You can't possibly... I can and I will, he said firmly. I'm a pediatrician, remember? Babies are my specialty. His warm brown eyes held hers steadily. We'll figure this out together, Margaret, 1 step at a time. For the first time since receiving the news, Margaret felt the panic begin to recede. She placed her free hand on her belly, where her 3 tiny children were growing. 1 step at a time, she echoed. Over the next several weeks, Thomas proved true to his word. He arrived at Margaret's townhouse every weekend with tools and paint, transforming her spare bedroom into a nursery designed for triplets. The key is efficiency, he explained, assembling the first of 3 cribs. Everything needs to be within reach when you're holding 1 baby and the other 2 start crying. Margaret watched him from the doorway, a protective hand on her growing bump. How do you know so much about multiples? Thomas smiled, tightening a bolt. I did my residency rotation in the NICU. Twins and triplets were common. Plus, I may have bought some books on the subject. You bought books? He shrugged, a faint blush coloring his cheeks. I like to be prepared. That evening, as they sat eating takeout on her couch, Margaret found herself studying Thomas's profile. His steady presence had become her lifeline these past months. Childbirth classes start next Tuesday, she said casually. The instructor said I should bring my partner. Thomas set down his fork. Do you want me to come? Only if you want to. I want to, he said simply. The following Tuesday, Margaret and Thomas sat among 5 expectant couples in a community center classroom. Margaret felt conspicuously different, not just because she was carrying triplets, but because every other woman had a husband or boyfriend beside her. Everyone find a comfortable position on your mat, the instructor called. Partners, sit behind the mothers and support them. Thomas positioned himself behind Margaret, his legs on either side of her, strong and secure. As she leaned back against his chest, she felt a strange new emotion breaking through her anxiety. Determination. I can do this, she whispered, half to herself. Thomas's arms encircled her gently. Yes, you can. And you will. In that moment, surrounded by his warmth, Margaret believed it. Despite everything Patrick had taken from her, she would create a beautiful life for her children, with or without him. Weeks later, the labor was relentless. 18 hours of contractions, sweat, tears, and determination culminated in the arrival of 3 tiny, perfect boys. Thomas never left Margaret's side, coaching her through each contraction, wiping her brow and offering his hand for her to squeeze until his fingers turned white. One more push, Margaret, Dr. Chen encouraged. The last one is almost here. Margaret's face contorted with effort as she bore down one final time. The sound of a third indignant cry filled the delivery room, and Margaret collapsed back against the pillows, exhausted but triumphant. "They're all here," Thomas whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "You did it, Margaret. You were incredible." The nurses cleaned and weighed each baby before placing them on Margaret's chest. 3 tiny faces with downy dark hair and miniature features looked up at her with unfocused eyes. Margaret's heart expanded with a love so fierce it took her breath away. "Hello, my beautiful boys," she whispered. "I'm your mom." Thomas stood beside the bed, his eyes suspiciously bright. "They're perfect, Margaret." She looked up at him, overwhelmed with gratitude. "We did it," she said, including him without hesitation. After all he'd done, he deserved to share in this moment. "No," he corrected gently. "You did it. I just had the honor of watching." Days turned into weeks. The first 3 months passed in a blur of feedings, diaper changes, and precious little sleep. Margaret moved through her days in a state of exhausted wonder, learning the unique personalities of each of her sons. Oliver, the firstborn, was thoughtful and observant, watching everything with serious eyes. Mason, who had arrived second, was more demanding, his cries louder and more insistent. And little Ethan, the smallest of the 3, was sweet-natured and easy to soothe. "I don't know how you tell them apart," Thomas remarked one evening as he helped with the bedtime routine. He had become a fixture in their lives, stopping by almost daily after his clinic hours. Margaret smiled as she gently rocked Ethan. "They're completely different to me, like 3 distinct songs playing at once." Thomas cradled Mason against his shoulder, patting his back with practiced ease. "I'm starting to hear it too." After the babies were finally asleep, Thomas and Margaret collapsed on her living room sofa, mugs of tea cooling on the coffee table beside stacks of fabric samples and design sketches. "How's the business plan coming along?" Thomas asked, nodding toward her laptop. Margaret tucked her feet under her. "Better than I expected. I've already got 2 clients willing to work with me remotely. I can do the design boards and sourcing from home, then schedule site visits during your days off." "Smart," Thomas nodded approvingly. Using your existing contacts was a good move. "It's still scary," she admitted, starting over at 38 with 3 babies. Thomas's hand found hers on the couch between them. "You're the strongest person I know, Margaret Reed. If anyone can do this, it's you." 6 months after the triplets' birth, Margaret's home office was fully operational. She'd converted the dining room into a workspace filled with fabric samples, catalogs, and a large drafting table. Her laptop was open to a video call with a client while Oliver played contentedly in a bouncer by her feet. "The custom cabinetry will take 8 weeks, but it's worth the wait," she explained, holding up a wood sample to the camera. "The grain pattern is exactly what we discussed for your kitchen renovation." After the call ended, Margaret scooped up Oliver and moved to the living room where Mason and Ethan were napping in their swings. She checked her watch. Thomas would be arriving soon with groceries. Their easy routine had developed naturally over the months, with Thomas stepping into the role of co-parent without either of them explicitly discussing it. Across town, Patrick sat in a sleek photography studio, checking his watch impatiently. Vanessa's photo shoot was running 3 hours over schedule, and they were already late for their dinner reservation. "Just a few more shots," the photographer called out. Vanessa posed dramatically against a white backdrop, completely in her element. Patrick sighed. Their wedding had been postponed twice already as Vanessa's modeling career gained momentum. He scrolled through his phone, pausing at a news alert about a property development he'd been eyeing. His life with Vanessa was glamorous but increasingly empty, filled with parties and photo shoots but lacking substance. For a brief moment, he wondered what Margaret was doing now, nearly a year after their divorce. probably still licking her wounds, he thought dismissively, unaware that at that very moment, Margaret was surrounded by the family he'd never known he had, building a life filled with purpose and genuine love. 4 years later, Margaret stood in the doorway of her home office, surveying the chaos of fabric samples, design boards, and architectural plans covering every surface. The spring sunlight streamed through the windows, illuminating the magazine covers framed on the wall, each featuring her work and the logo of Reed Interiors. What had begun as a desperate attempt to support her family had blossomed into one of the most sought-after design firms in the region. Her phone buzzed with a text from her assistant about a potential new client, a celebrity chef looking to redesign his restaurant. Margaret smiled. She could afford to be selective now, choosing projects that excited her creative vision rather than taking whatever came her way. "Mom! Mom! Look what I made!" 4-year-old Mason burst into the room, holding up a painting splashed with vibrant colors. His dark hair, so like Patrick's, fell across his forehead, but his expressive hazel eyes were all Margaret's. "It's beautiful, sweetheart," Margaret said, kneeling to examine his artwork. "Is that our house?" "Uh-huh. And that's you and me and Oliver and Ethan and Thomas." He pointed to each stick figure proudly. Margaret's heart warmed at how naturally Thomas had been included in her son's depiction of their family. Though they had never formally defined their relationship, Thomas had become essential to their lives, stepping into the role of father figure with natural ease. "Can we put it on the fridge?" Mason asked. "Absolutely. Let's go find your brothers." They walked through the house, no longer the mansion she'd shared with Patrick, but a charming craftsman with a large backyard that she'd lovingly renovated. The sounds of laughter led them to the kitchen, where Thomas was helping Oliver and Ethan decorate cookies. "I made the blue ones," Ethan announced, his face smeared with frosting. The smallest of the triplets, he remained sweet-natured and gentle. "Mine have the most sprinkles," Oliver added seriously. Always the thoughtful one, he had arranged his cookies in a precise pattern. Thomas looked up, his warm brown eyes meeting Margaret's. "I hope you don't mind the mess. We got a little carried away." "The best memories come from the biggest messes," she replied, stepping closer to help. Their hands brushed as they reached for the same cookie cutter, and the familiar electricity sparked between them. Thomas let his fingers linger against hers for just a moment longer than necessary. These quiet moments of connection had been happening more frequently, a touch while passing coffee in the morning, sitting close together during movie nights after the boys were asleep, long conversations that stretched into the early hours. Neither had pushed for more, both seemingly content with the family they'd created together, yet both aware of the unspoken potential between them. Across town, Patrick stood in the vast great room of his vineyard estate, watching as event planners transformed the space with elaborate floral arrangements and crystal chandeliers. After 4 years of delays and changing plans, his wedding to Vanessa was finally happening. "What do you think about these centerpieces?" Vanessa asked, her slim figure draped in designer clothes, her beauty even more polished than when they'd first met. "I think they should be taller." Patrick nodded absently, his attention caught by a business magazine on the coffee table featuring an article about up-and-coming designers. Margaret's photograph smiled back at him, looking more confident and radiant than he remembered. "Are you even listening?" Vanessa's irritated voice broke through his thoughts. "Sorry, just distracted by work," he lied, turning away from the magazine. The truth was more complicated. Despite achieving everything he thought he wanted, Patrick couldn't shake the hollow feeling that had settled in his chest over the years. Sunday morning at Margaret's house began as it always did, with Thomas at the stove flipping his famous blueberry pancakes while the boys set the table with colorful plastic plates. "Higher, Thomas! Higher!" Ethan squealed as Thomas lifted him to place the syrup bottle in the center of the table. "My turn next," Mason insisted, tugging at Thomas's pant leg. Oliver, ever the helper, carefully arranged forks and napkins. "Is it ready yet? I'm starving." Margaret watched from the doorway, coffee mug in hand, her heart full. This was their tradition: Sunday pancakes with Thomas, followed by adventures in the park or zoo, depending on the weather. The simple ritual had become the foundation of their family life. Thomas caught her eye and smiled, that special smile he reserved just for her. "Ready for breakfast, beautiful?" The boys giggled at the endearment, used to the affection that flowed easily between the adults in their lives. Margaret moved to Thomas's side, allowing herself to lean against him briefly. "Always," she answered softly. The wedding planner's voice crackled through Vanessa's phone speaker, each word landing like a physical blow. "I'm truly sorry, Ms. Chambers, but my father's health has taken a turn. I simply cannot continue with your wedding plans." "But we're only 3 months away." Vanessa paced across the polished marble floor of Patrick's vineyard estate, her stiletto heels clicking sharply with each step. "You can't just abandon us now." Patrick watched from the leather sofa, swirling amber whiskey in a crystal tumbler. The wedding plans had become increasingly elaborate and stressful with each passing month. Sometimes he wondered if they were planning a wedding or producing a theatrical event. "I understand your frustration," the planner continued, "but I've prepared a list of excellent replacements. There's one firm in particular that's been creating extraordinary events lately. Reed Designs. They're booked solid, but I might be able to call in a favor." Vanessa's eyes narrowed. "Reed? As in?" "They're the best in the city right now," the planner interrupted. "Everyone's trying to book them. Their aesthetic would be perfect for your vineyard setting." After ending the call, Vanessa turned to Patrick. "Did you hear that? Our wedding planner just quit, 3 months before the wedding." Patrick set down his glass. "We'll find someone else. There must be dozens of planners who jump at the chance to do our wedding." She recommended some company called Reed Designs. Vanessa scrolled through her phone. "I'm looking them up now. They do look impressive, very high-end." Patrick froze. "Reed Designs?" "Yes, apparently they're the hottest firm in the city." Vanessa didn't notice his reaction as she continued scrolling through photos. "I'm going to call them immediately." Meanwhile, Margaret blew out the candles on her birthday cake as her 3 boys cheered wildly, their small hands clapping with enthusiasm that made her heart swell. "Make a wish, Mommy," Ethan exclaimed. "I already have everything I could wish for," Margaret said, smiling at her sons and then at Thomas, who stood across the table with a camera, capturing the moment. After the boys were tucked into bed, exhausted from the birthday celebrations, Thomas led Margaret to the back porch, where he'd set up a small table with candles, wine, and dessert. "You didn't have to do all this," Margaret said, touched by his thoughtfulness. "It's not every day you turn 39. Thomas pulled out her chair. "Besides, the boys' idea of a celebration involves a lot of noise and sugar. I thought you might enjoy something a bit more adult." The night air was warm, filled with the scent of the roses Thomas had planted along her fence last spring. They'd grown into a beautiful privacy hedge, creating their own little sanctuary. Thomas poured the wine, his hands steady but his eyes betraying nervousness. "Margaret, these last 4 years." She looked up at him, her heart suddenly racing. There had been so many moments like this, quiet, intimate, teetering on the edge of something more. "They've been the best of my life," he continued. "Being with you and the boys, it's everything I never knew I wanted." Margaret reached across the table, taking his hand. "Thomas, No, let me finish," he said softly. "I want you to know how much you mean to me. How much all of you mean to me." The words seemed to catch in his throat. Margaret could see him struggling, wanting to say more but holding back. Instead, he squeezed her hand and smiled. "Happy birthday, Margaret." The moment passed, another opportunity slipping away, but the warmth between them remained. The following morning, Margaret arrived at her office to find her assistant, Lily, looking excited. "You won't believe this," Lily said, handing Margaret a coffee. "We just got a call from Vanessa Chambers. She's desperate for a wedding consultation. Their planner quit, and they need someone to take over immediately." Margaret nearly choked on her coffee. "Vanessa Chambers? As in?" "Yes, that Vanessa Chambers, the model. Apparently she's marrying some real estate mogul. It would be our biggest event this year, and she's willing to pay double our usual rate for the rush job." Margaret set down her cup, her mind racing. She hadn't spoken to Patrick in 4 years. He had no idea about the triplets, their sons, and now his fiancée wanted to hire Margaret to plan their wedding. "I told her you might be too busy, but she insisted on speaking with you personally," Lily continued. "I scheduled her for tomorrow at 2. I hope that's okay." Margaret took a deep breath. Her business was growing rapidly, and she'd been considering expansion. A high-profile wedding like this could launch Reed Designs to the next level. "It's fine," Margaret said, making a decision. "I'll handle this consultation personally." Margaret checked her watch for the 5th time as she pulled up to Patrick's vineyard estate. She was 15 minutes early, but her nerves had been fraying since the moment she'd decided to take this consultation. The boys fidgeted in their car seats behind her. "Are we there yet?" asked Oliver, the most impatient of her 3 sons. "Yes, sweetie. This is where Mommy's meeting is." Margaret took a steadying breath. When her regular sitter had called with a family emergency that morning, she'd nearly canceled the appointment. Instead, she'd packed coloring books, tablets, and snacks, hoping the boys would behave during what would surely be the most awkward business meeting of her life. "It's a castle," exclaimed Ethan, pressing his face against the window. Margaret couldn't deny the property was stunning, sprawling vineyards surrounding a Tuscan-inspired mansion with stone facades and wrought iron balconies. Patrick had purchased it just before their divorce was finalized. She'd never seen it in person. "Remember what we talked about? You 3 need to be on your best behavior while Mommy talks to these people about their party." She helped unbuckle them, smoothing down their matching blue polo shirts. "We'll be good," promised Ethan, always the most serious of the triplets. As they approached the massive front doors, Margaret straightened her blazer and put on her most professional face. This was business. She could do this. A housekeeper answered the door, leading them through a soaring entryway with marble floors and a crystal chandelier. The boys stayed close, unusually quiet as they took in the unfamiliar surroundings. "Mrs. Chambers is in the garden. Mr. Reed just arrived home and will join you shortly," the housekeeper explained, guiding them toward French doors that opened onto a stone terrace. Margaret's heart hammered in her chest. She hadn't expected Patrick to be present for this initial meeting. Vanessa rose from a wrought iron table as they stepped onto the terrace. She was even more beautiful in person, tall, slender, with perfect blonde hair cascading over her shoulders. Her smile faltered slightly at the sight of the children. "You must be Margaret Reed. I'm Vanessa." She extended a manicured hand, then glanced at the triplets. "I wasn't expecting company." "I apologize for bringing my sons. My childcare fell through at the last minute." Margaret gestured to the boys. "This is Oliver, Mason, and Ethan. They'll be quiet with their tablets while we talk." Vanessa's smile tightened. Of course. Children are so unpredictable. As Margaret settled the boys at a small table nearby with their activities, she heard the French doors open again. She steeled herself before turning around. Patrick stood frozen in the doorway, his face draining of color. His eyes moved from Margaret to the 3 identical boys, who were now looking up curiously at the stranger. "Margaret." His voice was barely above a whisper. "Hello, Patrick." She kept her voice steady, professional. "It's been a while." He took a step forward, then stopped, his eyes fixed on the triplets. Even at 4 years old, there was no mistaking their parentage. They had his eyes, the distinctive reed blue that had passed through generations. the same dimple in their left cheeks when they smiled. "These are—" He couldn't finish the sentence. "My sons," Margaret said firmly. "Oliver, Mason, and Ethan." Vanessa looked between them, confusion clouding her features. "You two know each other?" Patrick seemed incapable of speech, still staring at the boys with a stunned expression. "Patrick and I were previously acquainted," Margaret answered smoothly. "It was a long time ago." "Mommy, can I have my juice?" Oliver tugged at Margaret's sleeve. She reached into her bag, handing him his sippy cup, acutely aware of Patrick watching every movement. "They're 4, Patrick finally said. It wasn't a question. "Yes." Margaret met his gaze directly. The calculation was clear in his eyes. The divorce, the timing, the resemblance. The truth hit him visibly, like a physical blow. He gripped the back of a chair to steady himself. "Margaret, could we speak privately for a moment?" His voice was strained. "Actually, I'm here on business." Margaret pulled out her portfolio. "I understand you need a wedding planner on short notice. I believe I can accommodate your timeline, despite my full schedule." Vanessa clapped her hands together. "Wonderful. I've seen your work in Metropolitan Home. It's exactly what we're looking for." Patrick couldn't tear his eyes away from the boys. "Vanessa, could you give us a minute? But we need to discuss the— Please." His tone left no room for argument. Once Vanessa had retreated inside, Patrick took a step toward the children, who were now coloring contentedly. "They're mine." Again, not a question. Margaret lifted her chin. "Biologically, yes. In every other way that matters, no." Patrick's face contorted with a mixture of shock, anger, and something that looked surprisingly like grief. "You kept this from me? For 4 years. You made it clear what you wanted, Patrick. A new life. A younger woman. No baggage." Margaret's voice remained calm, though her hands trembled slightly. "I'm simply here to plan your wedding. If that's going to be a problem, I can recommend another firm." Patrick found himself inventing increasingly flimsy excuses to be present for every wedding planning session over the following weeks. Today's pretext involved questions about the lighting installation, something he would normally have delegated to his assistant. "I'm thinking gold-up lighting would complement the floral arrangements," Margaret explained, pointing to her design board while the triplets played quietly in the corner of Patrick's home office. Patrick nodded absently, his attention divided between Margaret's presentation and the boys. Mason was meticulously stacking blocks, his tongue poking out in concentration, exactly the way Patrick did when focused. The realization sent a pang through his chest. "Patrick? Are you listening?" Margaret's voice pulled him back. "Sorry. Yes. Gold-up lighting sounds perfect." He cleared his throat. "You've really thought of everything." Margaret glanced at her watch. "We should wrap up soon. The boys have swimming lessons this afternoon." "Already?" "They're learning to swim at 4. Pride swelled unexpectedly in Patrick's chest. "Thomas believes in early water safety," Margaret replied, gathering her materials. "He's been taking them to the community pool since they were 2. The mention of Thomas dampened Patrick's momentary joy. Over the past weeks, he'd pieced together the relationship between Margaret, Thomas, and his sons. Not officially romantic, Margaret had explained during one tense conversation, but clearly heading in that direction. "I'd love to see them swim sometime," Patrick ventured. Margaret paused, her expression guarded. "Patrick, we've discussed this. Casual visits would only confuse them." Before he could respond, Vanessa appeared in the doorway, her smile tightening at the sight of the children. "Still here?" she asked Margaret, her tone falsely bright. "I thought these meetings were supposed to be an hour." "Just finishing up," Margaret replied smoothly, gesturing for the boys to gather their toys. Vanessa's gaze lingered on Ethan, who was rubbing his eyes tiredly, a gesture Patrick recognized as his own. Her smile faded as her eyes darted between the child and Patrick. "Those boys certainly have distinctive eyes," Vanessa remarked. Such an unusual shade of blue. An uncomfortable silence fell over the room. Margaret busied herself with packing up, while Patrick suddenly became intensely interested in his laptop screen. The tense moment was interrupted by the arrival of Thomas, who knocked on the open door with one hand while balancing a picnic basket in the other. "Hope I'm not interrupting," he said cheerfully. "I brought lunch, Margaret. That new Italian place you wanted to try." The triplets abandoned their toys, racing toward Thomas with excited squeals. "Doctor! Tommy! Dr. Tommy!" Oliver tugged at Thomas's pant leg. "Did you bring the special cookies?" Thomas laughed, setting down the basket to scoop Oliver up. "What kind of doctor would I be if I forgot the medicine?" He produced 3 small paper bags from his pocket, each with a child's name written on it. "Chocolate chip!" Mason exclaimed, peeking into his bag. Patrick watched as Thomas effortlessly juggled all 3 boys' attention, asking about their morning and complimenting the tower Ethan had built. The easy affection between them was unmistakable. "I also brought something else," Thomas said, pulling out 3 identical toy stethoscopes, "for our hospital game later." The boys cheered, immediately placing the plastic instruments around their necks. "I'm going to be a doctor like Dr. Tommy," Ethan announced proudly. Patrick felt something crack inside him as he witnessed the scene. This man, this stranger to him, knew his son's favorite cookies, their games, their dreams. He'd been there for first steps, first words, while Patrick hadn't even known they existed. Vanessa sidled up beside Patrick, her voice low. "Isn't it interesting how those boys have your mother's eyes? And that dimple, the Reed dimple, isn't that what your family calls it?" Patrick tensed, watching as Margaret smiled warmly at Thomas, accepting the lunch he'd brought with a touch to his arm that spoke of deep familiarity and trust. One morning, Vanessa scrolled through her phone while Patrick showered, pausing at a text from her wedding planner requesting confirmation on the guest list. She opened the attachment, scanning the names until she reached Elaine Reed, Patrick's mother. 83 and still wearing Chanel to breakfast, Vanessa murmured with reluctant admiration. Her finger hovered over the name, remembering their awkward brunch last weekend. Elaine had been distracted, constantly checking her phone until Patrick stepped away from the table. "I saw the most remarkable photos," Elaine had whispered conspiratorially. "Margaret's boys, my grandsons, they're getting so big. That youngest one, Ethan, is Patrick's spitting image at that age." The bathroom door opened, releasing a cloud of steam as Patrick emerged, towel around his waist. "Your mother knows about the triplets," Vanessa said flatly, her voice like ice. Patrick froze. "What?" "Don't insult me by pretending." Vanessa tossed her phone aside. "She called them her grandsons, said Ethan looks just like you." Patrick sank onto the bed, droplets of water still clinging to his shoulders. "I was going to tell you." "When?" "After the wedding." Vanessa's voice rose. "Those children are Margaret's, aren't they? Your children." "I only found out myself a few weeks ago," Patrick said defensively. "I didn't even know she was pregnant when we divorced." Vanessa paced the room, her silk robe swirling around her legs. "This changes everything. Do you understand that? Those boys have a legal claim to your estate. They're 4 years old, Vanessa. They're not after my money." "No, but she is," Vanessa snapped. "Why else keep them secret and then conveniently appear right before our wedding?" "That's not what happened. Margaret didn't want me to know." "And now?" "What do you want, Patrick?" Vanessa stopped pacing, her eyes narrowing. "I've seen how you look at them. At her." Patrick remained silent, unable to articulate the complicated emotions that had been churning inside him since discovering the triplets. "If you want me," Vanessa said coldly, "you'll legally disavow any connection to those children. Sign away your parental rights. Prove they mean nothing to you." Patrick looked up, shocked. You can't ask that of me. I just did. Vanessa's expression hardened. It's them or me, Patrick. Choose. Across town, Margaret tucked the last of the triplets into bed. Thomas waited in the hallway, leaning against the wall with a patient smile. 3 stories and 2 glasses of water, Margaret whispered, pulling the door nearly closed. They're finally asleep. You're amazing with them, Thomas said softly as they walked to the living room. I don't know how you do it. Margaret collapsed onto the sofa beside him. Some days I don't know either. Thomas gently brushed a strand of hair from her face, his touch lingering. Margaret, I've been wanting to say something for a while now. Her heart quickened. Yes? These past 4 years, being here with you and the boys. His voice grew tender. It started as friendship, but it's become so much more for me. Margaret turned to face him fully. For me too, Thomas. The confession hung between them for a breathless moment before Thomas leaned forward, his lips meeting hers in a kiss that felt both new and familiar. Margaret's hand came up to rest against his cheek as she responded, years of unspoken feelings finally finding expression. When they pulled apart, Thomas rested his forehead against hers. I've wanted to do that for so long. A cry from the boys' bedroom interrupted the moment. Margaret pulled back, instantly alert. That's Ethan! They rushed to the bedroom where Ethan was sitting up, face flushed and crying. Thomas immediately went into doctor mode, placing a hand on the boy's forehead. He's burning up, Thomas said, concern etching his features. 103 at least. Within minutes, Ethan's condition worsened, his breathing labored, a rash appearing on his chest. Thomas's professional calm couldn't hide his worry. We need to get him to the emergency room, he said firmly. This could be an allergic reaction. Patrick was still arguing with Vanessa when his phone rang. Seeing Margaret's name, he answered immediately. It's Ethan, Margaret's voice trembled. We're taking him to Memorial Hospital. He's having some kind of reaction. I'll meet you there, Patrick said without hesitation. Where do you think you're going? Vanessa demanded as he grabbed his keys. My son is sick, Patrick replied, the words feeling both foreign and right on his tongue. I have to go. If you walk out that door, you've made your choice, Vanessa warned. Patrick paused only briefly before continuing toward the door. I guess I have. The hospital waiting room became the stage for an uncomfortable confrontation as Patrick arrived minutes after Margaret and Thomas. Ethan had been taken back immediately, with Thomas's medical credentials expediting the process. What are you doing here? Margaret asked when she spotted Patrick. You called me, he replied simply. He's my son. Thomas stood protectively at Margaret's side, his arm around her shoulders. Dr. Lawson has been their father in every way that matters, Margaret said, her voice tight with emotion and worry. Patrick's jaw clenched. I know that, and I know it's my fault I haven't been, but I'm here now. Before the conversation could escalate, a doctor appeared with news about Ethan. All 3 adults turned simultaneously, their complicated feelings momentarily eclipsed by concern for the little boy who connected them all. The reality of their situation hung in the air, impossible to ignore any longer. Patrick had made his choice, but what that meant for all of them remained uncertain as they waited to hear about Ethan's condition. 6 weeks after Ethan's recovery from his severe allergic reaction, Patrick stood in the elegant vineyard pavilion where his rehearsal dinner was taking place. Soft string music played as servers circulated with champagne and hors d'oeuvres among the gathered guests. Despite the perfect setting and meticulous planning, Patrick couldn't focus on anything but the entrance, waiting for her arrival. When Margaret finally appeared with Thomas and the triplets, Patrick felt the air leave his lungs. They looked like a family, a real family. The boys wore miniature navy suits with matching bow ties, while Thomas and Margaret coordinated perfectly in complementary colors. Margaret had styled her honey brown hair in loose waves, and she looked more beautiful than Patrick had ever seen her. Confident, happy, complete. Thomas held Mason's hand while Margaret guided Oliver and Ethan, who had fully recovered from his health scare. The five of them moved through the space with an easy familiarity that spoke of countless shared moments and routines. "They certainly cleaned up well," Vanessa muttered beside Patrick, sipping her champagne. "Though I still think children should be seen at the actual wedding, not the rehearsal dinner. Especially those three little troublemakers." Patrick stiffened. "What did you say?" "Oh, come on," Vanessa continued, oblivious to his darkening expression. "You've seen how they run around during our planning meetings. And now we have to pretend we're happy they're here? They're a constant reminder of your past. Our wedding should be about our future." Something shifted inside Patrick as he watched his sons proudly showing each other the tiny cufflinks Thomas had helped them put on. These weren't troublemakers. They were his flesh and blood, the children he'd claimed he wanted for years during his marriage to Margaret, children he'd abandoned before they were even born. "Our future," Patrick repeated, the words tasting bitter in his mouth. Across the room, Ethan spotted him and waved enthusiastically. The simple, innocent gesture broke something open inside Patrick's chest. Without thinking, he clinked his glass loudly with a fork, silencing the room. All eyes turned toward him. "I'd like to say something," Patrick announced, his voice unsteady. Vanessa touched his arm. "We planned to make our toast after dinner, remember?" Patrick gently removed her hand. "This isn't our toast." He took a deep breath and stepped forward. "Many of you know Margaret Reed, who designed this beautiful space for tonight. What most of you don't know is that those three handsome boys with her are my sons." A ripple of shocked whispers spread through the crowd. "Sons I didn't know existed until recently, because I left their mother before she could tell me she was pregnant." Patrick's voice cracked with emotion. "I walked away from my marriage for selfish reasons, telling myself I deserved more, that I deserved someone who could give me children, never knowing Margaret was carrying not one, but three of my sons." Margaret's face paled as all eyes turned toward her and the boys, who were too young to fully understand what was happening. "For 4 years, these boys have grown up without me because of my choices," Patrick continued. "And I've been living a lie, pretending I was building something meaningful when I had already destroyed the most important thing in my life, my family." "Stop this right now," Vanessa hissed, grabbing his arm. Patrick looked at her with sudden clarity. "I can't marry you, Vanessa. I'm sorry. You're choosing them? Now?" Vanessa's voice rose shrilly. "After everything we've built?" "I should have chosen them from the beginning," Patrick replied quietly. Vanessa's face contorted with rage. She yanked her engagement ring off and threw it at Patrick's chest before storming out, leaving stunned silence in her wake. Patrick slowly approached Margaret, Thomas, and the boys, stopping a respectful distance away. "I'm sorry," he said simply, "for everything." Margaret studied him for a long moment. "I believe you are. I know I have no right to ask anything of you, but I want to be part of their lives, if you'll allow it." Margaret glanced at Thomas, who gave her a supportive nod. "The boys deserve to know their father," she said carefully. "We can work something out." Patrick looked between them, seeing the subtle ways they leaned toward each other, the quiet understanding that passed between them. "And us?" he asked, already knowing the answer. Margaret shook her head gently. "There is no us, Patrick. Not anymore." She reached for Thomas's hand. "Thomas has been there through every fever, every nightmare, every milestone. He's loved them, and me, with actions, not just words. My heart belongs with him now." Patrick nodded, the finality of her words settling over him like a weight. He had made his choice years ago, and now he would have to live with the consequences. He had lost the woman he'd taken for granted, but perhaps if he proved worthy, he might still have a chance to be a father to his sons. A year has passed. The backyard of Margaret's home buzzed with excitement as 3 identical 5 balloons bobbed in the gentle spring breeze. The triplets, Ethan, Oliver, and Max, darted between clusters of guests, their laughter carrying across the carefully landscaped garden that Margaret had designed herself. "Daddy, watch this," Ethan called, performing a wobbly cartwheel that ended with him tumbling onto the grass. Patrick clapped enthusiastically. "That was amazing, buddy." He helped his son up, brushing grass from his knees. Maybe save the acrobatics until after cake. The past year had transformed Patrick in ways he never expected. The man who once prioritized status and appearances now showed up faithfully for school concerts with poorly made papier-mâché props, soccer practices in the rain, and bedtime stories during his designated evenings with the boys. Across the yard, Margaret arranged cupcakes on a tiered stand, her face lighting up as Thomas approached with a pitcher of lemonade. He whispered something in her ear that made her laugh, their comfortable intimacy evident in the way she leaned against him briefly before continuing her task. Patrick watched them, surprised by the absence of jealousy he might have expected. Instead, he felt something closer to gratitude. Thomas had been there when he wasn't, had loved his sons from the beginning, and had stood by Margaret through everything. "Need any help?" Patrick offered as he approached the refreshment table. "Actually, yes," Margaret replied. "Could you round up the boys? We're almost ready for cake." As Patrick gathered his sons, he marveled at how different each boy was, despite their identical appearances. Oliver, the thoughtful one, carefully carried plates to the table. Max, always in motion, couldn't resist swiping a finger through the frosting when he thought no one was looking. And Ethan, the natural leader, organized the other children into a semi-orderly line. "Everyone gather around," Margaret called, her voice carrying the gentle authority she'd developed as both a mother and successful businesswoman. The children clustered around the table, while the adults formed a loose circle behind them. Thomas stood beside Margaret, his hand resting lightly on the small of her back. "Before we sing," Margaret announced, "Thomas and I have something we'd like to share with everyone." Thomas smiled down at her, his eyes crinkling at the corners. "We wanted our family to be the first to know that Margaret has agreed to marry me." A chorus of cheers erupted. The triplets exchanged confused looks before Oliver asked, "Does that mean Thomas will be our dad too?" Margaret knelt down to their level. "Thomas has been part of our family from the beginning. This just makes it official." "So we'll have 2 dads?" Max clarified, looking between Thomas and Patrick. "Exactly," Thomas confirmed, his gaze meeting Patrick's over the boys' heads. Patrick stepped forward, extending his hand to Thomas. "Congratulations to both of you. The boys are lucky to have you." The sincerity in his voice surprised even himself. A year ago, such a moment would have been unimaginable. Now, seeing the genuine happiness on Margaret's face, Patrick understood that loving someone sometimes meant being happy for them, even when their joy didn't include you. After cake was served and presents were opened, Patrick found a quiet moment with Margaret. "You look happy," he said simply. Margaret nodded, her eyes finding Thomas across the yard where he was helping the boys with their new remote control cars. "I am. More than I thought possible after everything." "You deserve it," Patrick said. "I'm sorry it took losing you for me to learn what really matters." "Some lessons come at a high cost," Margaret acknowledged. "But look what we've gained." She gestured to their sons, their laughter filling the air. They have 2 fathers who love them, and that's something special. As the party wound down, Margaret found herself beside Thomas on the porch swing, watching Patrick help the boys test their new toys on the lawn. Thomas laced his fingers through hers, the engagement ring catching the late afternoon sunlight. "Happy?" Margaret leaned her head against his shoulder. "Complete," she corrected. Our family doesn't look like what I imagined years ago, but it's exactly what it should be." Thomas pressed a kiss to her temple. "To the future Mrs. Lawson and our extraordinary family." Margaret smiled, knowing they had built something real and lasting. A love founded on respect, friendship, and unwavering support through life's unexpected journeys. If you enjoyed this story, I've found another special one just for you. Our community can't stop talking about how heartwarming and moving it is. Click on the video in front of you to experience this beautiful story before it's gone. Special one just for you. Our community can't stop talking about how heartwarming and moving it is. Click on the video in front of you to experience this beautiful story before it's gone.